Hey friends, if you're a beginner, this is the best place for you to start. We're going to go over the beginner stitch sampler. I'm going to start with a satin stitch. So for that, I need only 2 strands of embroidery thread. So I'm going to trim this off of my floss here, and then I'm going to separate only 2 strands. And then we'll also be using our size 10 embroidery needle from our little pack here. And it's the smallest needle in here. If it's too hard for you to use, you can move up to the size 5 embroidery needle. The eye of the needle is really small, so it is hard to fit any strands of thread in there, but it will help you make the cleanest satin stitch. Then I'm going to trim off the tail just a little bit. For the satin stitch, it's very simple. It is one that I feel can be a little bit tougher to master, just because it requires a lot of patience and it takes forever, and I know a lot of you hate this satin stitch, so it's on pretty much every pattern I make because I love it. It does take forever though. So you start at the bottom of your shape, come back up, and then go back down, come back up, go back down. But the reason why I say to use only 2 strands is because when you have less strands, you can use a needle with a smaller eye, and that will allow you to create a lot smoother lines on the outside of your satin stitch. So for example, if we were to use the larger needle like the chenille 22 needle, it has a larger eye, and because of that it will make a larger hole in the fabric, and it's just going to be harder to have a more clean line the sides of your shape. Okay, for the back stitch, I'm going to use a chenille 22 needle with a full 6 strands of embroidery thread, so you don't have to separate them at all. And bringing my needle up at the top of my line, I'm just going to come down a little stitch length away on the same line, pull it down through the fabric. When I come back up through the fabric, I'm going to skip a stitch length when I bring it up. Then when I come back down through the fabric, it's going to be through that same hole we made our first stitch on. And this is the pattern you'll be repeating throughout the whole back stitch. Here's how I like to tie off my thread at the back of the fabric. I just pull it through some of my previous stitches, make a little knot, and trim it off. Now for the stem stitch, I'm still using the 6 strands with a chenille 22 needle, and I'm going to come up at the top of my line. I'm going to come back down, but I'm going to leave this little loop on the top of the fabric. Then I'm going to come back up right next to where I first came up through the fabric and pull that loop through. And I'm going to do the same thing now, so coming a stitch length away, leaving this little loop, some slack on the top of the fabric, then coming back through my last hole and repeating that process. And you want to make sure to hold that loop on the top of the fabric on the same side each time, because that is what will give you the twisted vine effect that the stem stitch has. The straight stitch is exactly what it sounds like. I am guilty of searching up what is a straight stitch on YouTube before, so just so you don't have to do that, I included it on the sampler. I don't want anyone to feel dumb because I was there too. So there's your straight stitch, and then you can just tie a knot off on the back of the fabric. And it is nice to use 2 layers of fabric, because if you have a stitch like this, then you can use the back layer to bring your needle through and tie the knot. Now for the long and short stitch, I'm still using the same 22 chenille needle with 6 strands of embroidery thread, and this entire stitch will be stitches that are going in and out of each other, but they're all going to go in the same direction. So some are going to be long, some are going to be short. What I like to do is just start with one small patch and fill in the fabric as much as I can. It's similar to a split stitch. I just come down through my previous stitch sometimes. Whatever you can do to fill the area, however you like. There's a lot of different ways to do this stitch, but for the sake of this pattern, this is how we're going to do that. So here's what the back of my fabric looks like so far. If yours doesn't look like this, don't panic, because who cares what the back of your hoop looks like. Okay, for the split stitch, I'm still using the 22 chenille needle, 6 strands of thread. So it's similar to a back stitch, but instead of coming back through my previous stitch, I'm going to split the first stitch I made. So every time I come up through the fabric and come back down, I'm bringing my needle down through that thread, through the last stitch in the middle of the thread. Now for the French knot, if you're a beginner, this will take some time. This was like my arch nemesis when I started embroidery, so definitely be patient with yourself. You can practice on other parts of the fabric if it is a little bit hard. The best piece of advice I can give you is to make sure that you're holding the thread taut against the needle. So when you come up through the fabric, you're going to hold your thread with one hand, the needle with the other, and then wrap loops around. Then you're going to make sure that you're holding it taut, not too tightly against the fabric, holding onto it to keep the little knot shape until you go down through the fabric. If you need extra help, I have another beginner tutorial here that might be helpful as well. Now for our little watercolor section, this is one of the most important parts I recommend that you practice. I'm gonna try out these sparkly watercolors because I've actually never used them with fabric, but I included this on the sampler because I know watercolor can be really intimidating when you add it to embroidery, and I want you to feel totally comfortable before you start on your final project. It can be a little bit tricky. I do have another full tutorial I'll link above that I recommend checking out if you've never done a mixed media project with watercolor. Really, the most important thing is making sure that you have enough paint on your brush and not too much water. Having too much water will cause it to bleed. If you go too close to the edges like I am right now, it's definitely going to bleed. I've never used these on fabric before, so I just wanted to see how they would work out. Obviously, I added too much water, as you can see here. And if you made it this far, then you are ready to start on the final project. So I will see you in the next video. Thanks for joining me, and I'll see you again soon.